Do you think we would have gained a victory if it had depended on General Grant alone? Oh, no. Then why is there a tomb on the Hudson at all? Why? Not simply because General Grant was personally a great man himself, but that tomb is there because he was a representative man and represented 200,000 men who went down to death for their nation, and many of them as great as General Grant. That is why that beautiful tomb stands on the heights over the Hudson. I remember an incident that will illustrate this, the only one that I can give tonight. I am ashamed of it, but I don't dare leave it out. I close my eyes now. I look back through the years to 1863. I can see my native town in the Berkshire Hills. I can see that cattle show ground filled with people. I can see the church there, and the town hall crowded, and hear bands playing, and see flags flying and handkerchiefs streaming. Well do I recall at this moment that day. The people had turned out to receive a company of soldiers, and that company came marching up on the common. They had served out one term in the Civil War, and had re-enlisted, and they were being received by their native townsmen. I was but a boy, but I was captain of that company, puffed out with pride on that day. Why, a cambric needle would have burst me all to pieces. As I marched on the common at the head of my company, there was not a man more proud than I. We marched into the town hall, and then they seated my soldiers down in the centre of the house, and I took my place down on the front seat, and then the town officers filed through the great throng of people who stood close and packed in that little hall. They came up on the platform, formed a half circle around it, and the mayor of the town, the chairman of the select men in New England, took his seat in the middle of that half circle. He was an old man. His hair was grey. He never held an office before in his life. He thought that an office was all he needed to be a truly great man, and when he came up he adjusted his powerful spectacles and glanced calmly around the audience with amazing dignity. Suddenly his eyes fell upon me, and then the good old man came right forward and invited me to come up on the stand with the town officers. Invited me up on the stand. No town officer ever took notice of me before I went to war. Now, I should not say that. One town officer was there who advised the teacher to whale me, but I meant no honourable mention. So I was invited up on the stand with the town officers. I took my seat and let my sword fall on the floor, and folded my arms across my breast and waited to be received. Napoleon the Fifth! Pride goeth before destruction and a fall. When I had gotten my seat and all became silent through the hall, the chairman of the select men arose and came forward with great dignity to the table. And we all supposed he would introduce the congregational minister, who was the only orator in the town, and who would give the oration to the returning soldiers. But, friends, you should have seen the surprise that ran over that audience when they discovered that this old farmer was going to deliver that oration himself. He had never made a speech in his life before, but he fell into the same error that others have fallen into. He seemed to think that the office would make him an orator. So he had written out a speech and walked up and down the pasture until he had learned it by heart and frightened the cattle, and he brought that manuscript with him, and taking it from his pocket he spread it carefully upon the table. Then he adjusted his spectacles to be sure that he might see it, and walked far back on the platform, and then stepped forward like this. He must have studied the subject much, for he assumed an elocutionary attitude. He rested heavily upon his left heel, slightly advanced the right foot, threw back his shoulders, opened the organs of speech, and advanced his right hand at an angle of 45. As he stood in that elocutionary attitude, this is just the way that speech went. This is it precisely. Some of my friends have asked me if I do not exaggerate it, but I could not exaggerate it. Impossible! This is the way it went, although I am not here for the story, but the lesson that is back of it. Fellow citizens! As soon as he heard his voice, his hand began to shake like that. His knees began to tremble, and then he shook all over. He coughed and choked, and finally came around to look at his manuscript. Then he began again. Fellow citizens! We are very happy. We're very happy to welcome back to their native town these soldiers who have fought and bled and come back again to their native town. We're especially pleased to see with us today this young hero, that meant me, this young hero who in imagination. Friends, remember, he said imagination, for if he had not said that, I would not be egotistical enough to refer to it. This young hero who, in imagination, we have seen leading his troops, leading his troops onto the deadly breach. We have seen his shining, we've seen his shining sword flashing in the sunlight as he shouted to his troops, "Come on!" Oh, dear, 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 dear. How little that good old man knew about war. If he had known anything about war, he ought to have known what any soldier in this audience knows is true, that it is next to a crime for an officer of infantry ever in time of danger to go ahead of his men. I, with my shining sword flashing in the sunlight, shouting to my troops, "Come on!" I never did it. Do you suppose I would go ahead of my men to be shot in the front by the enemy and in the back by my own men? That is no place for an officer. The place for the officer is behind the private soldier in actual fighting. How often as a staff officer I rode down the line when the rebel cry and yell was coming out of the woods, sweeping along over the fields and shouted, "Officers to the rear! Officers to the rear!" And then every officer goes behind the line of battle, and the higher the officer's rank, the farther behind he goes. Not because he is any the less brave, but because the laws of war require that to be done. If the general came up on the front line and was killed, you would lose your battle anyhow, because he has the plan of the battle in his brain and must be kept in comparative safety. I, with my shining sword flashing in the sunlight, There sat in the hall that day men who had given that boy their last hardtack, who had carried him on their backs through deep rivers. But some were not there. They had gone down to death for their country. The speaker mentioned them, but they were but little noticed, and yet they had gone down to death for their country, gone down for a cause they believed was right, and still believe was right, though I grant to the other side the same that I ask for myself. Yet these men who had actually died for their country were little noticed, and the hero of the hour was this boy. Why was he the hero? Simply because that man fell into that same foolishness. This boy was an officer, and those were only private soldiers. I learned a lesson that I will never forget. Greatness consists not in holding some office. Greatness really consists in doing some great deed with little means, in the accomplishment of vast purposes from the private ranks of life. That is true greatness. He who can give to this people better streets, better homes, better schools, better churches, more religion, more of happiness, more of God, he that can be a blessing to the community in which he lives tonight will be great anywhere. But he who cannot be a blessing where he now lives will never be great anywhere on the face of God's earth. We live in deeds, not years, in feeling, not in figures on a dial, in thoughts, not breaths. We should count time by heart-throbs in the cause of right, Bailey says. He most lives who thinks most. If you forget everything I have said to you, do not forget this, because it contains more in 2 lines than all I have said. Bailey says, "He most lives who thinks most, who feels the noblest, and who acts the best." Recorded by Paul Adams, www.yawnguy.com.